I'm so good to have this time with you. Today we're talking about dem bones. How do bones heal? Now, this is really a part of our series, Inflammation, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And the last call on Wednesday, we talked about how inflammation is crucial in the healing process for the skin. Today, we're going to talk about dem bones. What happens, because Mr. Hope always shows us on his slides, an injury to the skin. I love the little picture with the little girl with the thumb and the Band-Aid. And he's, from the surface of the skin to the depths of the bones, how the three-pronged approach and how Kangen water can be an important part of the healing process. But today we're going to talk about inflammation, because inflammation gets a bad rap. I was in medical school before I was taught, I didn't even realize, but before I was taught that inflammation is a necessary component in the body's immune system. So let's look at the bones today. And I have a lot of good juicy stuff for you, not only that I'm going to show you on the call, but resources that you can look up later. So, did I skip the screen share part? Let's get back to the screen share part. Here we go. All right, and welcome to those of you who've joined the call since we started. Okay. So hopefully you can see my screen. And I need to help one other person get in here. So I'm multitasking. Well, you can't really multitask, so I'm sorry, taking a pause. Okay, so before we went to the actual structure and function of the bones, I wanted to just give you an idea of what percentage of the body makes up the skeletal system. And if you look at this pie chart, the skeletal system is 20% of the body by weight, right? So if you separate out all the systems by weight, the muscular system is the largest. Of course, it depends on your body composition. And then the skeletal system next, and then the integumentary system, which is the skin, is next. But we remember there's a lot of subcutaneous fat possible here. So again, these numbers are just approximations, but it gives you an idea of how important it is to nourish and support your skeletal system. Give me one sec. 787, 8, 4, 2, 3, 7, 3. Okay. So when you look at bones, we think we got ideas of what bones look like this guy in the middle. But there are 6 broad classifications of bones in the body. And you can look here, you can imagine flat bones would be in the skull, but also your sternum, right? These flat areas. Irregular bones, your vertebrae, very irregular. There are sesamoid bones, like sesame seeds. That's where they get that name. So they're kind of round and, stuck in different places. But I'm going to talk about mostly long bones, because these are mostly the bones that end up getting fractured. Some, of course, any bone can be fractured depending on what happens, but most of the bones in your body are long bones. So those are most of the bones that are at risk. Now, a long bone doesn't necessarily mean that it's long in length, right? Because even the tiny bones in your finger, they are long bones. And they're called that because they have this structure. So let's cut one open. Got to do that. And we see that inside the long bone, there's something going on at each end, right? And then there's this long shaft. And one thing that I didn't know about bones is they have a huge blood supply, and it comes like, this is the nutrient artery. It goes directly into the middle of the bone shaft and then spreads. Then there are other arteries that come directly into the ends of the bone. Now, something that happens also within that center part is the marrow. And so I'm going to include in the resources, we're not going to read this article today, but I'm going to include a link to this article in Medical News Today about bone marrow. And it's pretty extensive. There's a lot going on in the bone marrow. And this is some of the stuff that's going on there, because there are a lot of cells that live in the bone You don't think about your bones being alive, right? They're alive until you think about, well, the calcium's got to get in and out somehow. The fractures have to heal somehow. There's a lot going on in bone and in bone marrow. So let's take a look at just a little corner of the bone. So this is the outer. So look up here. If we just took that long bone that we saw earlier and we cut it in half, and we're going to look at this little corner of the outer structure of the bone. And we can see that the bone is filled with blood vessels, lymph vessels, and these round structures. Now, these round structures extend from one end of the bone to the other. And this is, when you look at the physics of those structures, that's how the bones keep their strength, is what these internal structures are. But this is the functional, and I like to tell you the functional and structural unit of the organs that we're talking about. So I don't know if you remember, the functional structural unit of the kidney is called the nephron. Well, the functional and structural unit of the bone is called the osteon. And so you can see there's an osteon, 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 osteon. Okay. And around the bone, so this light blue area around the bone, we call the periosteum. That means it goes around the bone. And so it's a layer of tissue that, and that tissue is very, very important. Looks like, it just kind of keeps the bone intact. Well, it does more than that. So I just want to really impress upon you that the bone is very, very vascular. But look at this, your cartilage, which is that gristle that decreases friction when two bones meet that move. The cartilage has no blood supply. And that was something else I didn't know. I had this concept in my mind that every tissue or every cell in the body had to get blood, it had blood supply. No, there are tissues in the body that do not have the benefit of blood supply. So the cartilage, how does it get nourished? Well, there's a little bit of joint space here, a little bit. And in that little joint space, there's fluid. They call that the one name for it is articular fluid. And that fluid is what the cartilage is dependent upon for its nourishment, for its hydration, to keep it supple. So hydration is very, very important, not only to your body in general, but in particular, structures such as your cartilage that don't have any other way, they don't have any blood supply, they don't have any other way of getting rid of toxins and getting their hydration and their nutrition than from this little teeny tiny bit of fluid that's in the joint. So what happens when the bone breaks? When the bough breaks, that's another, but that's, if you talk about the tree, that's a bone. I'm sorry, back. Oh, before we break it, let's make it. So those different categories of bones have different ways of being formed. So the flat bones are formed in a very mysterious way. They call it ossification in a membranous matrix. But we're talking about the long bones. So here we go, the long bones. This is so cool. Have you heard that kids have very flexible bones, right? They kind of bounce and they fall from heights and whatever, and you think, how did they survive that? Well, this is how. Their bones really are flexible. Their bones start as cartilage. This is in the womb, but the cartilage is like the model. It's a form, and then that model, that cartilage, over time gradually becomes ossified or calcified, and that calcification starts in the center, and it goes eventually to the ends, and then the top and the bottom of the bones do the same thing. And eventually we have this is not a mature bone because there's still some cartilage, some of that cartilage model left. And we call this the epiphysis. So you might have heard, if you got a kid that's had a fracture, the first thing they wanted to know, was the epiphysis involved? Well, that's this growth plate. This is how the bones get long. This is where the bones get longer until the child reaches maturity. So this is a very, very active part of the body right here, because that's how they grow. So what happens when bone breaks? Well, there are a lot of different types of fractures depending on the type of force that occurred. I mean, it takes a lot of force to overcome the strength of a bone. And understandably, it's a traumatic experience, but people get over it, right? How? It's nothing that we do. When I say we, the doctors, right? The body does the work. We just kind of keep things aligned so that when the body does its work, the bones heal in a proper orientation and a proper alignment. But it is amazing. So we've got 4 basic steps. And the first step is the fracture itself. And depending on what kind of fracture will determine how serious the fracture is. If the bone is broken, but the periosteum stays intact, it acts like an internal Band-Aid. It kind of can control the bleeding that happens at this bone that break. But if the periosteum is compromised, if the bone is if the bone punches through the periosteum, if it's punches through even the skin, it could. That bleeding is extensive, and so it's much, much, much more important to get medical attention right away. Now, the second part is, well, once the clot forms, that's what this means, a fracture hematoma. Hematoma is a blood clot. So once that clot forms and the blood finally stops, or the bleeding finally stops, well, then the immune system gets into action, and it actually starts to form cartilage inside the blood clot. Just like it was forming cartilage inside the womb, it forms cartilage again. And that cartilage, while it's doing that, it also has to do something else. All these fragments of bone, they have to be removed. And the body actually has cells that chew the bone. They're called osteoclasts. And the bones that build, they're the osteoblasts. And so your osteoblasts build, your osteoclasts chew. So, and it's this whole delicate dance of demolition and construction or reconstruction. And as you can see, the blood vessels have to be reconstructed. The nerves have to find their ways back to the right pathways. There's a whole lot of activity going on for your immune system. All right, so here we go. That cartilage starts getting calcified, and we have what's called a callus. A callus, if you're, my dad was a drummer, and he had calluses right on his fingers where he held the drumsticks, right? And this callus is harder than this callus was, but the idea is that there's a thickened area, and the callus is really where the new bone is formed. And over time, eventually, there's going to be remodeling. So the osteoblast and the osteoclast, based on the stress of the muscles that pull and the electrical signals from the muscles, they all they'll chew up the outer edges and reform on the inner edges. It's really amazing. So I also wanted to show, this is a scanning electron micrograph. And this is showing the difference between normal bone and bone of osteoporosis. And, you might think, or I'm sure you think of calcium as being important in osteoporosis, and it is, but as you can see, it's not just calcium, right? We need all the nutrients to support this bone, or else it's the inner matrix, they call these trabeculae, of the inside of the bone are going to deteriorate more rapidly. So ladies, particularly while you have estrogen, is a time to increase your calcium, because estrogen really helps the calcium get into the bones. But when you don't have estrogen, then we have to actually do even more to help to slow the loss of calcium from the bones. And we never want to see bones like this, right? We want to keep our bones strong. What we don't want to do is to artificially stop that dance between the osteoclasts and the osteoblasts, which is what the medications do that you might hear advertised, to quote unquote make what those medications do. And remember, this is in general for most medications, for most pharmaceuticals, I'll put it that way. They block something. So what do those medications do? They block the osteoclasts. And the thinking was, well, if the osteoclasts are chewing the bone, we'll stop them from chewing the bone and then let the osteoblasts just build the bone and make the bone stronger. Well, it makes the bones maybe more dense, or maybe a little heavier. There may be a little more calcium deposition, but the bone structure has been compromised. And I can't think of a good analogy right now, but you're not putting the individual molecules, you're not putting the individual components of the bone in the right in the right amounts and in the right configuration to make those bones strong. So you're going to have thick, brittle bones. You're not going to have bones that have the structure and the function they're supposed to. So just a little, just a small taste, a small overview of how bones heal. Now, I do have a couple more things I'm going to share with you in the call resources. For instance, I like having resources I can share with kids, and especially talking about broken bones. So KidsHealth.org has this article, and like I said, I will post it in the call resources. When you go to YouTube, search for Kangen Water Radio, and you'll find our playlist. And each call has the articles that I used, and sometimes the PowerPoints. I will include this PowerPoint during the call, so you can review the materials yourself. So, but I love, when it's broken down to the level that kids can understand. And so it talks about the kinds of broken bones. There's one kind they don't put here, and that is called a spiral fracture, and that fractures from a twist. And that's, usually if you're yanking a kid back from the, that's how those happen. We used to see too many of those in the emergency room. But there's a little slideshow in there how bones heal, and it's the very simplified version of the same process that I showed you on the anatomy slides. So I will include this article, and let's see, we'll talk later, maybe after Mr. Hope, but I will include the article of 10 natural ways to build healthy bones. And we'll see how many of them we agree with as we apply the three-pronged approach and the good food, bad food, particularly the bad food list, to those suggestions. All righty.